He didn't belong anywhere, at least that's what the world kept trying to tell him. From the moment he could remember, he had been navigating rooms that weren't made with him in mind. Classrooms with broken projectors and substitute teachers, job fairs with recruiters who smiled too hard before turning their eyes to someone else, bank offices where he filled out forms that were never quite enough. The story was always the same. Too rough. Too unpolished. Too poor. Too him. He learned early not to react. Not with anger. Not with desperation. But with calculation. While others shouted at closed doors, he took notes. While they begged for access, he looked for the hinges. The neighborhood didn't offer much, but it taught him everything. How to read tone before words, how to move around danger without becoming part of it, how to spot sincerity in a sea of survival. He had no connections, no safety net, no legacy. Just a stubborn refusal to be defined by someone else's ceiling. His first business was small. A repair gig. Phones, laptops, routers, things no one else wanted to fix. He didn't have a storefront, just a backpack and a network of trust. He undercut big shops on price and outperformed them on speed. He never advertised. Word of mouth was faster anyway. Eventually, he had clients with jobs in offices he'd never been allowed into. They'd meet him outside, hand over their broken tech, and go back inside, never once thinking he might one day own the building. Money came slowly at first, then in steady waves. He reinvested everything. Took online courses at night, not for degrees but for skills. Studied business models, coding languages, supply chains. He built systems that didn't require anyone to open doors for him. Systems that turned quiet margins into growing empires. He bought his first property through a shell company, an old warehouse at the edge of the city. Everyone thought it was a mistake. But he turned it into a co-working space, outfitted it with high-speed internet, coffee machines, and security better than most downtown towers. It filled up in 3 months. Then he bought another building. And another. Each one registered under a new name, a new holding group. On paper, he was invisible. In reality, he was everywhere. No headlines. No interviews. No social media. He liked it better that way. By the time the tower came on the market, he was ready. It was one of the most iconic buildings in the financial district, glass panels stretching to the sky, a lobby filled with curated art and curated people. He'd passed it 1,000 times growing up, always from the outside, always moving faster when the security guard stared too long. Now it was crumbling on the inside. Poor management. Missed payments. Lawsuits. The kind of thing no one talked about until it hit the wrong news cycle. He bought it in silence. No fanfare. No announcement. Just a wire transfer large enough to erase any doubt and a legal team sharp enough to make it airtight. And still, even after the ink had dried, even after his name sat on the deed behind layers of paperwork, no one in the building knew who he was. That was by design. He wanted to see how they treated him before they knew they had to. So he walked into the lobby one morning wearing what he always wore. No badge. No briefcase. Just presence. The kind that wasn't granted, it was earned. They didn't recognize him. They never did. The receptionist glanced up, then quickly back to her screen. She tapped her keyboard, frowned. "Do you have an appointment?" He said no. That was all it took. Her lips pressed together, her back straightened, and the smile she gave was coded in something sharper than disapproval. It was certainty. Certainty that she didn't need to ask who he was. Because people like him didn't belong in buildings like this. She made a call. He stood still. Security arrived 2 minutes later. Not aggressive. Just firm. "This is private property, sir." He didn't flinch. Didn't argue. Didn't say, "I own it." He just walked away. Because the meeting he had scheduled wasn't with them. It was with the board. Upstairs. At noon. And when he stepped into that room, cleaner now. Suited, silent, the receptionist wouldn't be there. But they would. And the memo? It would have his name at the top. In bold. The elevator rose slowly, its interior mirrored and spotless. He stood still, watching his reflection without expression, hearing the soft buzz of the floors passing behind the polished walls. The same elevator he had never dared approach as a teenager. The one security always stood too close to. The one that symbolized the boundary between those who worked in the lobby and those who controlled what happened above it. Now it carried him past every floor. All the way to the top. When the doors opened, the atmosphere shifted immediately. No lobby noise. No client chatter. Just muted carpet, frosted glass, and the sterile hum of wealth doing its best to pretend it wasn't cold. The receptionist on this floor didn't ask for his name. She had already been told to expect him. She stood before he could speak and gestured toward the boardroom at the end of the hall. Inside, 12 people sat waiting. Men and women in tailored suits postured around a long marble table, expressions calibrated to appear both welcoming and in control. They didn't know what to expect. Some of them hadn't seen his face yet, only the name. Others had researched just enough to feel curious but not enough to feel threatened. Yet, he entered the room without a word, placed his tablet on the table, and took the seat at the head. It was the kind of room built to make outsiders feel smaller. But he didn't shrink. He looked over the group slowly, giving each of them the moment to recognize what was happening. Some shifted in their chairs. One smiled a little too wide. One leaned forward as if preparing to speak, then decided against it. He tapped once on the tablet. The screen at the far end lit up. Numbers. Graphs. Legal docs. The structure of the deal. The breakdown of ownership. The vision for the next quarter. It was already in motion. This meeting wasn't about approval. It was a courtesy. Still, he let them speak. Questions came carefully at first, probing his strategy, questioning the shifts he proposed. They spoke in corporate dialects, trying to regain footing, trying to reassert the logic of hierarchy. He answered without raising his voice. With facts. With future models. With historical context they hadn't considered. By the third slide, the room was silent, because it had become clear that he wasn't improvising. He was operating. And he had been long before they'd ever noticed. When the meeting ended, one of the partners lingered behind. A man who had built his career through charisma and handshakes, the kind who prided himself on being a connector. He approached with the look of someone trying to align himself with a shifting narrative. "I had no idea you were involved," he said. Andre just nodded, because he knew what the man really meant. He meant, "I had no idea someone like you was allowed to own something like this." But he didn't say that, because people like him never said it out loud. They didn't have to. The building said it for them. Until now. Andre walked back down through the building slowly. He took the stairs instead of the elevator. Each landing brought him face to face with something that had once been above him. Names etched on glass doors. Titles printed in font just large enough to intimidate. But now none of it carried weight. Now the walls spoke a different language. Ownership. Not just of the building, but of the narrative. When he reached the lobby again, the woman at the desk glanced up and froze. She blinked twice, her hand still hovering over the keyboard. He didn't stop. Didn't smile. Didn't correct her. Because this wasn't about proving her wrong. It was about proving himself right. Outside, the city buzzed as it always had. Horns. Footsteps. Wind between buildings. The same rhythm. But now he walked through it not as a man trying to break in, but as the man who had already bought the lock and changed the code. Ownership brought silence. Not the kind that came from isolation or doubt, but the focused, loaded kind that came when noise no longer served a purpose. He no longer needed to explain himself. Not to the people in suits. Not to the people who flinched when he walked through the door. Not to the ones who only learned his name after they'd tried to erase his presence. The building's transformation didn't begin with walls or furniture. It began in the wiring, deep in the system where policies, priorities, and hidden assumptions lived. He brought in his team, quiet operators with sharp minds and sharper values. They didn't tear anything down. They analyzed. They asked questions. Why were the same 3 firms handling every contract? Why did promotions plateau at mid-level management? Why did certain applicants never make it past the second interview? The data didn't lie. Bias didn't shout. It hid in spreadsheets, in gut feelings, in hiring rubrics that favored familiarity over merit. It showed up in which ideas were labeled scalable and which were deemed too niche. It showed up in which doors stayed unlocked. For some, he didn't call it out. He replaced it. The first to leave were the ones who couldn't adapt. Not fired, just exposed. Their methods outdated, their value overstated, their networks fragile once the illusion of control cracked. They excused themselves in resignation letters laced with professional euphemisms. Realignment, strategic divergence, seeking new challenges. He let them go, not out of spite, out of space-making. He knew real change didn't come from shouting at resistance. It came from building systems where resistance was irrelevant. New teams took shape. New vendors were on board, smaller firms, community-rooted, lean and hungry. They were just as competent, often more so, but had been excluded for years because they lacked polish or access. Now they had both. The culture began to shift. It wasn't immediate. Some employees adjusted easily. Others quietly resented the new atmosphere. The elevator conversations changed. So did the hallway energy. People began watching what they said, not because they were afraid, but because the invisible rules were different now. Accountability had replaced assumption. And then the ripple began. People from outside the usual orbit started requesting meetings. Smaller nonprofits, independent tech founders, grassroots organizations. At first, the assistant filtered them out, assuming they didn't meet the level. But Andre corrected that. Every request was reviewed. Not all accepted, but none ignored, because he remembered what it felt like to be dismissed without ever being read. One Thursday afternoon, he sat in the corner of a planning meeting. No one introduced him. Most assumed he was an advisor or external observer. The topic was workspace redesign, budget reallocations, updated amenities, security enhancements. A junior analyst suggested opening a portion of the building to host weekend workshops for under-resourced students. The idea fell flat. Too risky, too outside scope, not aligned with brand. Andre spoke for the first time. He said, "Build it." There was a pause. No pushback, just quiet recalibration. Because his voice didn't just carry weight, carried finality. The workshops launched 6 weeks later. Quietly, successfully, and just like that, the building began to serve a different purpose. Not just prestige, but presence. Meanwhile, Andre stayed in the background. No press, no LinkedIn updates, just results. He walked the building like a ghost, knowing every corner, every name on every badge, every coffee machine that hadn't been serviced in 3 weeks. People began to recognize him, not through memos or photos, but through the way the room changed when he entered. Not with fear, with focus. Because when a man walks through a space he was once denied and chooses to lead without vengeance, people notice. And when that man builds a future from the same bricks that once built his exclusion, the foundation becomes unshakable. Month 4 brought something new. Not resistance, not compliance, but curiosity. The building had stopped trying to figure out what he was doing and started wondering how it had ever functioned without him. The changes that once felt disruptive now made sense. Meetings began starting on time. Decisions were faster. Departments that had once operated in isolation now cross-collaborated without being told to. It wasn't because of fear or rules. It was because the culture had shifted without needing slogans. He never talked about inclusion. He just built systems where exclusion was impossible. The new community wing opened in the West Wing, what had once been dead square footage reserved for show. Now it was alive. On Saturdays, it held youth coding workshops. On Sundays, financial literacy programs. In the mornings, independent startups pitched for small grants. No press, no cameras, no donors seeking credit. Just opportunity, filtered straight from the top. People outside the building began noticing. Not from advertising, from word of mouth. Something's different in there. You should try applying again. No one asks what school you went to before they ask what you can build. Andre heard the echoes everywhere. One afternoon, he walked through the employee kitchen and found 3 interns arguing over a whiteboard sketch. Constructive, collaborative, sharp. They stopped when they saw him. He didn't interrupt, just nodded and kept moving. They returned to the debate immediately. That mattered more than any pitch deck. Meanwhile, the upper floors had begun to fracture. Not in chaos, but in identity. The old guard, still clinging to the familiar cadence of status, was dwindling. Their meetings had fewer chairs. Their networks grew quieter. The investors who once answered their calls now asked to speak to him instead. That wasn't revenge. That was gravity. Influence moves to where vision lives. But Andre didn't gloat. He didn't remind anyone of the receptionist who once called security, or the managers who once questioned his legitimacy. He didn't even correct them when they called him Mr. J. Instead of his full name, he just worked, because the building was no longer a trophy. It was an engine, and the engine was moving. That month, he received an offer to sell. A tech conglomerate wanted the space, offered double its value. They promised to preserve the brand, to maintain the programs, to name a conference room after him. He declined in one line, "Legacy can't be bought." The offer made its way around the industry. Some called him foolish. Others called him radical. But he didn't need anyone's definition of smart. He was playing a longer game. That Friday he stood in the lobby, just for a moment. He hadn't done it in weeks. The same lobby where he'd once been told he didn't belong. He stood there now as people moved past him. Staff, guests, clients, community members. They didn't flinch. They didn't stare. Because now he wasn't invisible. He was normal. And that was the win. To walk through the same doors that once held you back. Not in defiance, but in peace. To lead not with a spotlight, but with a blueprint. To be the reason no one else had to hear, "You don't belong here," ever again. By month 5, the building no longer whispered the old messages. The walls that once echoed hierarchy now hummed with motion. People didn't just show up, they invested in the space with their energy, their presence, their ideas. There was no longer a dress code that rewarded conformity. No gatekeeping disguised as professionalism. No invisible map of who got to speak in the room and who had to wait their turn. The rules had changed, and so had the people who stayed. The old scripts had died out quietly, without funerals. No one spoke of them. No one missed them. They simply faded, like dust brushed from a surface that hadn't been cleaned in years. Andre was in the office less now, not because he was detached, but because his presence had become foundational. He had done what most people in power never tried to do, make himself unnecessary. The building ran without his constant touch. Not aimlessly, but with inherited direction. His influence wasn't broadcasted, it was built into the plumbing. He'd given people permission they hadn't even known they were waiting for. One department head initiated a mentorship chain, pairing junior hires with seniors from different teams. Another launched a rotating town hall lunch, where interns could bring feedback directly to leadership. None of these were Andre's ideas, but all of them were proof of his impact. And while the building changed, the world outside still hadn't caught up. That month, an article was published in a local business journal. It praised the transformation of the property, called it a new model for inclusive development. It didn't mention his name, not once. It credited the firm's evolution to progressive culture shifts and forward-thinking team dynamics. He clipped the article and saved it in a folder called Uncredited Wins. He didn't need the spotlight. He needed the structure. But he noticed the omission, because it was a reminder. For all the progress made inside the building, outside of it, the narrative was still shaped by familiarity. People like him weren't expected to lead revolutions quietly. They were expected to either burn things down or stay invisible. He did neither. That week, he returned to the rooftop space, his favorite place to think. The skyline was thick with fog. The city lights blurred like watercolors. He stood there, arms crossed, watching the movement of traffic far below. The rhythm, the tension, the repetition. All of it. He thought about how close he'd come to quitting years ago, when every door stayed shut and every meeting ended before it started. He thought about how many others never made it through. Not because they weren't brilliant, but because brilliance in the wrong room goes unseen. That's why he stayed invisible for so long. Because being underestimated had been his best disguise. But now, disguise wasn't necessary. Because he wasn't hiding. And no one had the power to push him out anymore. One evening, a team of young developers from a nearby university visited for a private tour. They'd been following the building's changes, reading about the workshops, the community wing, the mentorship programs. Most of them had never stepped foot inside a place like this. Andre didn't greet them in a suit. He met them in jeans and a quiet smile. He told them stories. About systems. About pressure. About how some walls weren't made to be broken, they were made to be replaced entirely. One of the students asked what made him keep going when everything seemed closed. He paused before answering, then said, "Because I knew someday I'd build the kind of place that would never say that to you." Month 6 arrived without ceremony. No milestones, no ribbon cuttings. Just another Monday. But the building had changed in ways that couldn't be undone. It breathed differently. People moved through its halls with purpose, not permission. The ones who had once tiptoed now walked boldly. The ones who had once assumed control now listened more than they spoke. The building had become what few places ever did, a reflection of the people it once excluded. Andre wasn't in the office that day. He sat at a cafe 2 blocks away, hood pulled forward, headphones in, scanning reports on his tablet. Not because he needed to work, but because he still liked watching the city move from the outside. Old habits weren't easy to shake, even when you owned the rooms you used to be locked out of. That morning, he received a letter. Not an email, a physical letter. It came from a young woman who had applied to the building's business incubator program. She'd been rejected from 3 other accelerators, all of which praised her potential, but noted she lacked polish. This place was different. Here she was funded, supported, seen. Her letter didn't thank him for the opportunity. It thanked him for making a place where she didn't have to ask for permission to dream big. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in the same folder where he'd saved the article that never mentioned his name. Legacy didn't need headlines. It needed impact. Back at the building, things continued as usual. The reception desk had a new face, someone trained not in protocol but in people. The art on the walls rotated monthly, now curated by local creatives who had once been told their work was too raw. The security staff walked with calm awareness, not rigid authority. No one talked about diversity anymore. It was lived, not labeled. Andre arrived later that afternoon. He didn't head straight to the boardroom or the rooftop or the office with his name on the frosted glass. He walked slowly through the main floor, nodding to a janitor, fist-bumping one of the marketing interns, stopping for 5 minutes to help a technician realign a touch panel in the elevator bay. Because this was his building, but it wasn't his stage. He paused at the entrance just as a man stepped through the doors, mid-40s, expensive suit, sharp cologne, practiced smirk. The kind of man who once would have held court here without question. The kind who had, in another life, once looked at Andre and seen nothing worth noting. The man glanced at him, did a double take, then narrowed his eyes. "Can I help you?" Andre didn't answer. Just let the question hang. Because once, that same man, or someone like him, had said those same words not with curiosity but with judgment. With a gatekeeper's tone. With the belief that some people simply didn't belong here. But now? There were no gates left. Andre turned without a word, stepped into the elevator, and let the doors close behind him. Upstairs, the final quarterly numbers were waiting. The projections were solid. The impact reports even stronger. Every data point confirmed what he already knew. He hadn't just changed a building. He'd rewritten the rules of access. And in doing so, he hadn't just claimed power. He'd redistributed it. Because true ownership isn't about control. It's about deciding who gets to walk through the door behind you. And making sure they never have to knock the way you once did.